Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria channel. We're back again in my garden, in front of my bush, one of my bushes, and we're going to look today at something which actually spans various different types of sword from various different periods, but we're going to apply it specifically to the Langmesser that I'm wearing here, Landsknecht Emporium. And but this also applies incidentally to sabre, for example. And just going off on a tangent for a second, I know I do a lot of tangents in my videos anyway, but I do regard the sabre that I'm normally talking about on my channel as actually the successor in a way to the Langmesser. I do think that there is a connection between the Langmesser, the Dussac, and hangers, and then sabres. I do think there is absolutely a continuous connection between those things. So I kind of see this as the medieval sabre in many, many ways. But what we're going to talk about here is the positions that you put your body in when you use a sword relative to the fact that the sword has to be worn and has to be carried. Now, as you can see, I've got a fairly simple suspension system that Landsknecht Emporium make with this Langmesser. It's very practical, very comfortable. It enables the sword to wiggle around a bit, but it doesn't flail around. It doesn't get stuck between your legs. You can walk around, you can jump around, do all sorts of things, and it doesn't really get in the way. It's very practical. In many ways, it's a bit like a Western gun holster. It just kind of stays where it needs to be. And if you need to quickly get a sword, you can get a sword. But there's something you need to do in order to get the sword out reliably. I can simply go, someone's attacking me, and just go down here and pull the sword out. I can do that. But it's not super reliant for a number of reasons. Just doing that, the problem is that the sword can bind against the scabbard, get stuck in the scabbard and things like this, and you can in fact pull the whole scabbard up and it gets stuck. Okay, so usually instinctively, without even thinking about it, most people using any kind of scabbard and drawing a sword will go with the left hand to the scabbard and pull out with the right hand. Okay, and that is the most reliable way, pretty much with almost any type of hanging scabbard at your left hand side, to get the sword out reliably without fail. There's also a degree of push-pull involved there, because of course you can pull away with the scabbard at the same time that you pull out with the sword that way. Now there's one detail to doing this that I would say if you want to keep your fingers on your left hand, and that is you can't always trust every scabbard. Scabbards do get bashed around, they do perish. So obviously I'm an antique dealer, and I see a lot of broken and damaged scabbards. Scabbards get damaged, and during the service life of one of these swords they'd probably go through several different scabbards. They'd have to be replaced, especially when you're talking about the age of wood and leather scabbards. And incidentally, in the military period, in the sort of industrial military period from the 18th, 19th centuries, that is explicitly stated in written sources that wooden and leather scabbards are better for maintaining the edge of the sword, and for all sorts of other reasons. They're lighter and this kind of stuff. But the reason that people went to steel scabbards is steel scabbards are much stronger and robust. And if you're an industrial nation producing weapons and equipping thousands and thousands of soldiers, then you want things which aren't going to be breaking and needing maintenance the whole time. If it's a personal weapon, that's a different situation. So by the late 19th century, certainly in Britain, officers' swords often did have what I call a field service scabbard, which is a wooden leather scabbard. But the cavalry troopers, for example, at the same time had steel scabbards, because you would want the cavalry troopers to just go, there you go, that's the armoury, there's your sword, don't break it, but it's been made super heavy, kind of super strong, super robust, so that's unlikely to happen anyway with your steel scabbard. And they ended up wooden lining the steel scabbards to try and preserve the edges, but still having a steel on the outside. Anyway, I digress. So we've got a wooden leather scabbard here, and the problem is they do perish, and one of the risks is that the edge can come through here. We see this more with curved swords and things like kukris and stuff like this, because the curve tends to bite into the wood. Straight swords, less of an issue, but nevertheless be wary of the fact that the edge can break through wood and leather scabbards, and definitely if it's just leather that can happen. So you would be more safely advised to grip the thing without gripping tightly around where the edge is. Okay, so apply pressure to the scabbard there, a bit like you're grabbing a blade basically. So apply pressure to the flats and not necessarily to the edge. And equally, when you do pull out, try to pull straight out and don't apply any drag or kind of slice that will bite into and damage the scabbard. You'll increase your scabbard's lifespan by having a straight pull and not letting it kind of slice through the material. Right, so we've put the left hand down, we've grabbed the scabbard. We want to pull the sword out. I've already shown there. You pull it out here. Okay, now if we freeze frame there for a second and look at the position we're in. Now, what's very interesting is a number of fencing systems, both from the earliest fencing system, I-33 using sword and buckler, right the way through the kind of side sword and rapier periods, right the way up through back sword and sabre, have one of their first positions with the hand in something approximating this, either the position in which the sword would start off in the scabbard, so sword and buckler might be here, for example, and this is also known as sottobraccio in Mancellino and Marozzo. So you'd have the buckler out on your fist and you'd have the sword underneath the arm. This happens to be the starting position, so imagine someone attacks you, you come down to here, you get your buckler off the hilt, you get the buckler out to protect you, and then you draw the sword out, and going through this position is coming through guardia di sottobraccio, so under the arm guard, okay, and you might to then come up to guardia di alta or whatever, okay. So so that's a first position. Equally, we have in later systems first position or prime can be here, so it's as if you've just drawn out of the scabbard. But there's something else that I want to specifically talk about, and that is, what is the left hand doing all this time? Well, let's assume we don't have a buckler or a shield, so this left hand doesn't have a job to do in holding something here, but it does have a job to do in holding something here. Not only in drawing the weapon out, okay, at the position of, right, I need to hold my scabbard in order to get my sword out. Oh, now I'm fighting, am I? And now I need to hold the scabbard out of the way, because we don't want it to get in the way. And inevitably, one of the most sensible positions to put the hand and scabbard in is round here, either on the hip or tucked in behind the back. And lo and behold, what do we find from Langmesser sources to Dussac sources, right the way through backsword sources into sabre sources? The left hand, usually there is no, in the treatises, there's no scabbard and belt shown, because they're not showing what would be worn fully in real life. In fact, they're usually just in almost their underclothes when they're shown in the treatises. Sometimes they're shown naked. But the left hand, in whether we're talking about Langmesser, Dussac, backsword, sabre, unless there's a specific reason for the hand to be in front, and indeed some backsword sources have the hand out in front to deflect thrusts, but the left hand is usually or very often held behind the back. The other exception is held up here, and that is done with some backsword systems, and that comes predominantly from smallsword. But nevertheless, we see a continuation from the 15th century right the way through to the 19th and 20th century, in fact, of the hand either being on the back or on the hip. And very often when I'm doing videos about sabre, people ask me, oh, why do you have the hand on the hip? Well, in fact, that's not particular to sabre. As I say, we can go all the way back to Langmesser, and you'll find Langmesser sources, Talhofer, Paulus Cal, whatever, with the hand behind the back, exactly as it is shown in some 19th century sabre sources, and Cutlass as well, incidentally, and Dussac. Okay, so the hand on the hip or behind the back isn't functionally really different, but what you've got to bear in mind is, in reality, the person's going to be wearing a scabbard, so you've got to do something with that scabbard. And in fact, we do have some 19th century sources, military sources, that show exactly this, and the scabbard is being held up behind the back. So basically, there is a great continuity in fencing, and I often talk about this, and it's when we talk about sport fencing as well, it's one of the points I try to make, is that fencing is fencing, and a lot of the considerations of someone in the 15th century are actually the same as someone in the 19th or the 20th century. And if you wear a sword, you carry a sword, it's got to be in a scabbard. When you get the thing out, you've got to draw it in a certain range of ways, dependent on how the scabbard's attached to you. And once you've drawn the weapon out, you've got to do something with the scabbard. You could just leave it flapping around, and in fact, with this particular suspension system, it's not a giant problem. Equally with some of the rapier hanging systems as well, some of them hang in such a way that they don't really get in the way, especially if you go into quite a low stance. But Many times a person will be holding the scabbard and will want to get the scabbard out of the way, so it makes sense to hold it up behind your back or on your hip. I hope that's been somewhat interesting and useful. I actually would like to, I've never actually really done it. I know Nick Thomas from AHF has done it. I'd like to experiment a little bit more with wearing scabbards during sparring. The other question that I think might come up as well is some people might go, Matt, can you use the scabbard? And in fact, yes, we see the scabbards used defensively and very occasionally offensively. We see it in 15th century sources. You can find it in Fiore, you can find it in Vardi, you can find it in a couple of German treatises as well. And you do find it even in the 19th century stuff. I know at least one French military sabre treatise where the scabbard is used defensively. In fact, it could be a little bit late, could be about 1900 if I remember correctly. So yes, scabbards can be used defensively, possibly even offensively. There's the one apocryphal tale from the Crimean War of someone charging into battle with their scabbard, I think because they either lost or broke their sword. I can't remember. I think they were striking people with their sword and their sword broke, so they took the scabbard and hit them with the scabbard. But it's probably not true, that story, but it's nevertheless, it's of the period, so it shows that people did realise, certainly with a steel scabbard, you could use it as a weapon as well, a kind of truncheon. So there we go, scabbards. Again, it's all about context. It's all about looking about, okay, how does this weapon system work, and why do we do things the way we do? And there's usually a reason. And if a treatise shows a weapon being used in a certain way and a certain stance, and your hand in a certain position, there's usually a very, very logical reason for that. And in fact, in terms of the hand in the back on the hip, that's not the only reason. Don't think I'm saying that. There are other reasons for that as well. It's about bringing the rear shoulder back, turning your body on more narrow, balance, all sorts of things. Keeping it out of the way of these kind of cuts and stuff like that. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting. Give us a like and a subscribe. I'll see you again for another video on Scholagladiatoria channel. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.